This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
I first began coming to China in early 1989. For 30 years, I've witnessed the country becoming the second largest economy in the world. Once a backward economy in a closed society, China is now engaged openly with every country on earth. This year, 2018, marks 40 years of China's reform and opening up, a historic era of economic dynamism and social development. Looking to the past, what challenges were faced? What obstacles were overcome? Looking to the future, what lessons to learn, what principles to apply? Watch our special series on Closer to China, 40 years and counting. In this 40th year of China's reform and opening up, President Xi Jinping calls for comprehensively deepening reform and further opening up. That's why we titled this series 40 Years and Counting, Transforming Reform and Opening Up for the New Era. What lessons have been learned, what challenges lie ahead. In this final episode, we explore why, after 4 decades, China still needs to reform and open up further. We take a retrospective look at reform and opening up and what they mean prospectively for China's goals at 3 critical dates: 2020, 2035, 2050. We distinguish between reform and opening up, elucidating each and assessing how the 2 transformational ideas have enabled what China calls its peaceful rise and what the Chinese experience can mean for the world, especially for the developing world. Reform and opening up have marked an inflection point in Chinese history. From a closed or semi-closed society to the largest trading partner of more than 120 countries and actively engaged with multiple international bodies, including the UN, WTO, G20, and BRICS. There are challenges, of course. Domestic tensions are not waning, and international frictions are not weakening. It's an exciting time to be closer to China. Shi Tiechun has been working in the Ningbo Zhoushan port for about 40 years. In 1979, 1 year after Shi began working here, the city of Ningbo, Zhejiang province, was officially open to the outside world.
At the very beginning, there were 2 shiploaders. Now there are 4. The rest are also gradually being built up. Now, our throughput has increased and is ranked number 1 in the world.
After 40 years of development, the Ningbo port is now trading and shipping raw materials and manufactured products with more than 90 countries and regions.
Geographically speaking, Ningbo is close to the T-shaped intersection of the Yangtze River and the middle of the country's coastline. And it is also in the Yangtze River economic belt. Historically, Ningbo was for centuries one of China's main gateways to the maritime Silk Road, and it was one of the first 14 coastal cities that were open to the world at the beginning of reform and opening up.
In 2017, Ningbo was selected as a pilot zone for projects connected to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Chen Yi, general manager of a trading company in Ningbo, says the Belt and Road Initiative has allowed her company to tap markets in Central and Eastern Europe.
Currently, we mainly import from Poland and Romania. Our import products cover more than 200 varieties, ranging from milk, snacks, to skincare products and cosmetics.
Central and Eastern European countries are important components of the Belt and Road Initiative. To strengthen bilateral trade ties, various measures are being set to facilitate cross-border transactions, especially cutting logistics costs and reducing transportation time.
We focus on building cooperation between China and the Central and Eastern European countries, and will speed up construction of the Economic and Trade Cooperation Pilot Zone. Ningbo is a pioneer city for collaboration with this region. We have held several ministerial conferences on promotional trade and have held many years of trade fairs.
The Belt and Road Initiative creates a need to expand the Ningbo Zhoushan port. By 2022, the port is set to handle 1.2 billion tons of cargo per year. Minister Zhang, historically, how would you describe the era that China's in, China's new era? What are its primary characteristics?
China has entered a new era, faced with a new mission and a new test. What's so new about all of this? It means that even after 4 decades of reform and opening up, this process is now widely accepted as a long, arduous task, which isn't easy to complete. In my view, it will take us another 40 years, at least, before we see the desired effects. China today faces an ever-changing world, which is true for both our domestic affairs and the international environment. Personally, I see these changes occurring in 4 main areas. First, the worldwide change in productivity. Second, the shift in international and major country relations in general. Third, the downturn in Sino-US relations specifically. Fourth, the changing domestic affairs within both China and America.
China doing the gradualism. Gradualism means you have so-called incremental changes. When you have incremental change, that means you have growth. You change first on the part of the growth, then you change the stock. That's easier because you didn't take some cheese from somebody else, right? You don't really recut the cake. You just let the cake grow, and you just take the growth part of the cake. That's easier. So this growth, this global market, this foreign investment, this high growth really provide opportunities for China to do the reform, do the changes it needed.
The Chinese government would say that we're opening up more, everybody's more welcome, but yet among almost all groups of foreign companies operating in China, if you look at the American Chamber of Commerce in China, the European Chamber of Commerce, they all for the last couple of years had said in their statistics that most companies feel the opposite, that it's harder to do business for a whole series of reasons. So how do you see that disconnect?
Well, I would say on one side there is a perception issue. On the other side, there is some real issue. Perception issue is that China dismissed all the so-called supranational preference for the foreign companies, right? Tax and other preferred conditions in past years. Number one. Number two, really there's Chinese industries growth. Chinese company now growing stronger, become more competitive to the multinationals. That creates the problem.
What type of external pressures on China to propel it forward in reform are healthy, and what kinds are unhealthy?
Healthy pressure externally is there should be a continuous source, gradual source, to push China to recalibrate the role of state vis-a-vis the role of the market, economically and politically. There should be a healthy source of external pressure to encourage China to speed up its process to set up a state that is based on the rule of law system. Those people who are outside China should be more patient, and I believe that philosophically Chinese believe the tenet that truth need to be sought by facts. Now, if empirically, whatever policy line you support, and that line does not support good performance, you need to make an adjustment. And this is a big part of the principle that China, or the Chinese, have bought in the past 40 years of reform.
A big global shopping village. This is the world's first import-focused national-level expo. China is showcasing its commitment to continue to open up its massive market to the world while promoting multinationalism. At the opening ceremony of the China International Import Expo, China's President Xi Jinping assured the global community that China will open its markets wider and that its economy remains robust despite some obstacles and challenges.
The Chinese economy is the big ocean, not a small pond. Sometimes on the ocean, the waves are peaceful and wind steady. Sometimes there are also big winds and rain. Without big winds and rain, it's not an ocean at all. Big winds and rain can destroy a small pond, but not the ocean. After countless winds and waves, the ocean is still there. After over 5,000 years of hardships, China is still here. Facing the future, China will be forever here.
At the 6-day expo, intended deals for one-year purchases of goods and services reached nearly 58 billion US dollars. And China is taking measures to further open its vast market. A tariff cut for imports on over 1,500 industrial products goes into effect on November 1st. The move, affecting sectors such as machinery, textiles, and construction materials, brings down the general tariff level from 9.8% to 7.5%. This is the 6th time in 3 years that China has reduced its tariffs. Yet everyone recognizes that more progress is needed to further broaden market access. In July, Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla, the celebrated U.S. electric car company, announced the opening of its first factory outside the United States in Shanghai. This is the first car factory in China that is 100% foreign-owned. In addition to automotive, ship, and aircraft sectors, foreign ownership caps are also being raised in the banking, securities, and insurance industries. Economic globalization optimizes global efficiencies and is unstoppable. China will continue to develop, and the world will continue to benefit. We're now in the 40th year of reform and opening up, and that phrase, reform and opening up, has become like one word, but in fact it's two separate concepts, reform and opening up. So from your experience, having lived the process, how would you see how the two work together?
China has learned over the past 40 years is that opening up remains a crucial component of reform overall. In return, opening up further promotes reform. The two have a symbiotic relationship. So I believe that as we open further, it will attract more foreign capital, which will be granted equal rights with domestic capital. Speaking of the legal front, China will aim to better protect the interests of foreign companies and foreign capital.
Reform and opening up are actually two sides of the same coin. If we summarize our experiences over the past 40 years, one lesson is about the interactive, symbiotic relationship between reform and opening up. For example, as we open further and establish joint ventures with foreign capital, we may find that some parts of our old system no longer fit the new reality, so we'll need to reform our management system as well. With that in place, we may find even greater leeway to open up further. In a nutshell, I can clearly see the interactivity between them.
Well, I would say the opening up is a kind of condition. Without this condition, you cannot reform very successfully. But fundamentally, you need a domestic reform. If you don't change the domestic institutions, even you expose yourself to the outside world, if even you're inviting companies to come to your country, but if you don't change your domestic system, your domestic company cannot really grow up, and your society cannot change, and your government still behave the same way. So it's not you go nowhere. So fundamentally, I still give importance to the domestic reform, to do your own things, homework. That's still important.
When we talk about China opening up further, it's not just opening up China's markets, but China going out to the world.
Well, it's both ways, actually. We have been opening up ourselves to the rest of the world in the past 40 years, primarily to the advanced part of the world. But as I said, if the world has a population where only 20% are rich, 80% are poor, well, the economy is in trouble because you need to have a reasonable match between supply side of growth and demand side of growth. So it makes a lot of sense, both theoretically and empirically, to help the poor countries to develop so that we can generate a lot of win-win scenarios. To me, knowledge is global, experience is local, and you need to combine both experience and knowledge to push the developmental agenda. And there, China has a role to play, linking both advanced economies and less advanced economies. For South-South cooperation, I see our role as a platform to share ideas and experience of growth.
What can countries in Africa, Central Asia, throughout the world, what should they look to China? How can they maximize the benefit of working with China as China looks to go out to the world?
Well, China probably has some lessons to share with those developing countries. Now, to change the whole country will be difficult. To change the whole population will be difficult. Strategically, we need to be concerned about sequencing. Who goes first? Which part goes first? For instance, it makes a lot of sense, looking back, for China to set up special economic zones, given the fact to change the whole country is so difficult. When a special economic zones be part of a global value chain, part of the global production, part of global investment, part of global trade, and those special economic zones become a success. Immediately, they become a physical demonstration for others to learn. Now, most people learn by doing things. If you do not have those quick physical demonstrations, it is very difficult to learn.
Some part of China's economic development and the growth to review some very important relationship among the different factors for the economic growth. For example, the infrastructures. For example, the education. For example, the private sector. So that is universal from that point of view. But also, it's a universal issue for everybody, but it's reviewed very clearly from China's past 40 years of economic taking off. So I think that's may be good to apply to other economies as well. It's another institutional model. It's not just growth model. It's what the factors you need to grow up.
You know, there's some perception in the West that China wants to so-called change the global governance system to make it more Chinese or to make it more conducive to China's way of doing things, and yet China has benefited a great deal from what has happened. So, you know, knowing both cultures, how do you deal when people wonder whether China's trying to undermine the global neoliberal order that has existed?
You know, sometimes people say China changed the status quo. Well, the 40 years of high growth itself changed the status quo of the world. Yeah, you have China now, the second largest economy, and then you have Asia together. Now is very big, and it's going to be bigger because it's the most dynamic part of the world, and that changed the status quo. That have to change, and that have to have some changes. You know, bring some changes to the international organization. Not only the distribution of the power, how much your voting power in the international organization. Not only that, but different culture, different governance. From different religion. The same principle to different people in a different stage of development. That may not make sense. May not make real sense.
From China's remarkable experience over 40 years of reform and opening up, what are the kinds of lessons or experiences or indeed wisdom can be transmitted to other countries, particularly developing countries in Africa and Asia, Latin America, around the world, who can benefit from some of these principles?
As China found a development path to match its own national conditions, I think the country has also accumulated valuable experiences that it can share with some of the world's other developing countries. However, I've never suggested that we should export the Chinese model to any other country, because that's exactly what China has learned not to do. Don't copy and paste anyone else's model for reform. We can tell stories of our reform, share our experiences and best practices with any other developing country across the globe. Yet the most important lesson is that you must start out based on your own national circumstances. This is fundamental to China's experience. Never ever borrow ready-made models or adopt the experiences of others. Rather, start with your national conditions, assess your own development stages, then customize your own tasks and objectives for reform and opening up.
What's happening in China, like what's happening in most countries, is that developmental models are modified continuously to suit changing realities without concern for ideological labels or political categories. As the world's second largest economy, China says it is now beginning to provide public goods to other countries and to the global commons. But, paradoxically, ironically, China feels that just when it stopped being a so-called free rider and its global responsibilities began to grow greater, suspicions about China's global ambitions also began to grow greater. The terms peaceful rise and peaceful development epitomize China's 40 years of reform and opening up. You, of course, were intimately involved in the development of these concepts. So what do they mean, and how do you distinguish between peaceful rise and peaceful development?
The world calls for peace and development. This era calls for peace and development. Take China as an example. We've needed to accelerate our peaceful development for quite a while. Not to develop at an ordinary rate, but development at an accelerated rate, to increase productivity and speed up reforms in all respects. This is a principle of China's Communist Party. Therefore, I think the term peaceful rise conveys that message. This is necessary and also a requirement of history. China can't drag along too slowly. Such a pace of development wouldn't help us catch with the rest of the world. On the other hand, for how long can we maintain this accelerated pace? It can be an endless journey. In 1978, the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee laid out a clear objective: focus on productivity and accelerate development. Some 70 years lay ahead of us before we finally accomplish the mission of our primary stage of socialism, which is by the middle of the 21st century, realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This is also an element of what we call peaceful development, a notion that we've pursued ever since the 1970s.
What are some of the challenges going forward that China should be concerned about?
To me, there are three sets of challenges that we continue to face. One is how to deal with the administrative monopolies. This is one. This is a difficult one. Part of our population has become rich. That part probably has become resistant to further reforms. The second part is how to make people think more innovatively. Now, ultimately, this is the source of growth. It's the human being's mind, creative thinking, innovative thinking, that can continue to add additional source into the economy. And the third set is the one that China has been doing in the past 40 or so years, and with quite an amount of determination. It is how to unleash additional allocative productivity into the system. We have set up markets of goods and services. We are yet to set up markets for resources and the factors of production. Now, that one is also difficult as we finished with the markets of goods and the services. To set up markets of factors of production is difficult, and it will be deeply political.
So as you look to the future, what would be the prescriptions that you would give, or the target areas that you would say that need to be prioritized?
So I think the very broad direction for reforms of the economy is indeed striving for more productivity, striving for more innovation. A lot of that can come still from catching up. So it's not just the high tech, it's not just the R&D, it is also just continue to learn from what other countries are doing better, what foreign enterprises are doing better, or what some of the domestic enterprises are doing better, but the techniques haven't yet trickled down to all parts of the economy. And that really requires more competition. Second, for a more innovative China, I believe the government is already quite on track in terms of what sectors they want to target, and they've given sufficient support. But to create the innovative environment among enterprises, and it's a very, very ephemeral reform, if you want, but creating that innovative environment in which innovators thrive is going to be very important. And that includes this balance between state and non-state, and to make sure that innovators can also benefit from the innovations that they produce. So it has to do with strengthening of intellectual property rights and if you want, the rule of law and certainty of reaping the benefits of innovation is going to be important.
President Xi Jinping has articulated 3 key dates: 2020, 2035, 2050. What's the role of reform and opening up at each of those dates, and what's the ultimate goal?
Ever since 1978 and that landmark third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee, China's vision of development has shifted from simply providing enough food and clothing for the grassroots to working towards Xiaokang, a moderately prosperous society, and now to full modernization by the middle of 21st century. That's still quite far away. However, we've long been aware that even after we successfully build a moderately prosperous society, it might take another 50 years to achieve a fully modernized China. So we can consider this as a transitional period, as we comprehensively strengthen our moderately prosperous society. So we set aside some additional time, which lasts until 2020. From 2020, China's focus will be on full modernization and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This is how we identified our different stages of development. The 18th National Congress further clarified that once we build a moderately prosperous society in every respect, we'll aim for full industrialization by 2035. Then by 2050, full modernization and great rejuvenation.
When China's leadership looks back on the country's 40 remarkable years of reform and opening up, and then looks ahead to the grand goals of China 2035 and China 2050, what do they see? What has changed, not changed, should change, and never change? What has changed? The economic miracle, becoming the world's second largest economy, astonishing elevation in standards of living, unprecedented global engagement. What has not changed? Still low GDP per capita, still a developing country, continuing growth fueled by continuing urbanization, tensions between quantity and quality of growth, social contradictions exacerbated by rising expectations. What should change? Reduce social disparities, pollution, and fears of a China threat, enhance social services and scientific excellence, increase contributions to the developing world and to the global commons. What will never change? Continue to follow China's own model, continue to pursue development as top priority, promote new ways of thinking, seek inclusive growth, sustainable development, social democracy, a beautiful country, and a civilized and harmonious society, and promote win-win cooperation for a global community with a shared future. For China to achieve these grand goals, the country's domestic and international affairs must be integrated. President Xi Jinping has promised the more developed China becomes, the more open it will be. Much has been accomplished, much more must come. That's closer to China.